civil rights movements, and freedom. Lecture terms. Mass society and its critics. Mass society. Despite the apparent rule of consensus in American society, in which McCarthyism made criticism of the status quo seem disloyal, freedom seemed to be located in the private enjoyment of consumer goods, and political debate was narrowed by the Cold War. Dissent did exist, however. Some intellectuals thought that affluence in the Cold War mentality obscured the degree to which the United States did not live up to its own ideal of freedom. In 1957, the political scientist Hans Morgenthau argued that free enterprise had created, quote, new accumulations of power that threatened individual liberty. Sociologist C. Wright Mills challenged the idea that democratic pluralism defined American life anymore. He argued that America was now ruled by a, quote, power elite, which was an interlocking directorate of corporate leaders, politicians, and military men who dominated the government and society, thus making political democracy obsolete and denying real freedom of choice to Americans. Some argued that modernity itself produced psychological and cultural discontent, and they worried that mass society produced a loneliness and anxiety that made people desire not freedom, but rather authority and stability. Social scientists and critics argued that Americans were conformists ultimately, who were unable to be independent thinkers and actors, and that corporate bureaucracies turned employees into, quote, organizational men, incapable of independent thought. Other critics worried that Americans had lost their commitment to the common good. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith, in his book, The Affluent Society, published in 1958, wondered how American society could neglect investment in schools, public parks, and public services while producing ever more goods to satisfy consumer desires. What had happened to American values? Other books criticized the monotony of modern work, the emptiness of suburban life, and the influence of advertising. Mad Men once again comes to mind. But this social and cultural critique did little to transform American life in the 1950s. Rebellion as alternative. These critics did not offer a political alternative or influence party politics or government. But with a very large and growing young population, thanks to the baby boom, popular culture revealed tensions beneath the quiet surface of 1950s life. J.D. Salinger's novel Catcher in the Rye, published 1951, and films like Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, emphasized the alienation of the youth from the adult world. Such work stimulated adult fears of widespread juvenile delinquency and led even comic book publishers to regulate their publications. Indeed, cultural life was more daring than politics. Teenagers wore leather jackets and danced to rock and roll music that brought hard rhythms and sexually provocative movements of black musicians and dancers to white audiences. This embodied by none more than the extremely popular Elvis Presley. The debut of magazines like Playboy openly flaunted a fantasy world of sexuality for men outside the family, and gay men and lesbians, though considered deviant by larger society, established their own subcultures in America's major cities. In New York, San Francisco, and small college towns, the Beats, a small group of poets and writers, rebelled against mainstream culture. The term beat, invented by the novelist Jack Kerouac, signified, quote, beaten down and, quote, beatified or saint-like. His book, On the Road, written in the early 1950s, but not published until 1957, captured the aimless wanderings of the main character across America and offered a spontaneous series of sights, sounds, and images to capture the imagination. The book captivated a generation of young people who rejected middle-class life but offered no alternative to it. Likewise, Allen Ginsberg's book Howl, published in 1955, written while the author was taking hallucinogenic drugs, was a sprawling poem that rallied against materialism and conformism. The Beats rejected the work ethic. They rejected suburban middle-class materialism, and they rejected the Cold War's militarization of American life. They celebrated, instead, impulsive action, immediate gratification, often enhanced by drugs, and sexual experimentation. The Freedom Movement. Focus question: what were the major thrusts of the civil rights movement in this period? The Freedom Movement. The most significant challenge to 1950s complacency was the greatest citizens' movement of the 20th century, the black struggle for equality. The civil rights movement, though celebrated today, was at the time a great surprise. The causes today seem apparent. From World War II's destabilization of the racial system and the mass migration out of the South that made black voters a larger part of the Democratic coalition, to the Cold War and the rise of the independent Third World, both of which exposed the gap between U.S. rhetoric and realities. But few predicted that a mass movement for civil rights would develop in the South. Some thought that a movement might emerge in the North, but there, blacks' allies and black groups had been damaged by McCarthyism and limited by the racism of union leaders and the exclusivity legal strategy of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. The Southern movement, instead, had its basis in Southern black churches, which organized a militant but nonviolent assault on segregation. In the 1950s, the United States was still a segregated and unequal society. Half of America's black families lived in poverty. Because of seniority rules that protected white workers in the industrial workforce, blacks lost their jobs first when the economy soured. In the South, Jim Crow characterized all kinds of separate public institutions. And in the North and West, not law but custom barred blacks from colleges, hotels, restaurants, and most suburban housing. In 1950, 17 southern and border states and Washington, D.C. required the racial segregation of public schools, and several more states allowed local districts to segregate. Few whites felt it was urgent to challenge racial inequality. The legal assault on segregation. With the defeat of Truman's Civil Rights Initiative and the Eisenhower administration's reluctance to confront race relations, segregation was attacked first in the courts. In California, a challenge to segregation there by Latino groups led to the desegregation of public schools in that state in 1946. The governor who signed the measure, Earl Warren, had presided over Japanese-American internment, but after the war, he came to oppose racial inequality. In 1953, Eisenhower appointed Warren Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Meanwhile, the NAACP, led by Thurgood Marshall, continued its campaign of legal challenges to the, quote, separate but equal doctrine that had been imposed by Plessy versus Ferguson. By 1950, Supreme Court rulings in several cases suggested that segregated institutions of higher education for blacks were not actually equal to those open only to whites. Marshall soon directly attacked racial segregation in public education. The NAACP worked on several cases challenging the unequal treatment of black children in schools across the country. In 1952, 5 of these cases were combined into a single appeal case to the Supreme Court, whose title was the first case listed, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. In this case, Marshall attacked not the unfair application of the, quote, separate but equal doctrine, but the doctrine itself. He argued that even with the same funding and facilities, segregation was unequal because it stigmatized one group of citizens as unfit to associate with others. Using psychological studies, Marshall stated that segregation inflicted lifelong damage on black children by undermining their self-esteem. The Eisenhower administration, in a brief on the case, urged the court to recognize the damage segregation inflicted on America's reputation abroad in the context of the Cold War. The new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, read the unanimous decision on May 17, 1954, which stated that segregation in public education violated the equal protection of the law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, thus striking down the separate but equal doctrine that had protected segregation since Plessy versus Ferguson. Although hailed by the black press as a, quote, second Emancipation Proclamation, the decision did not outlaw segregation in institutions other than public schools or ban racial classification in the law. It did not address de facto school segregation in the North either, that was based on residential segregation rather than state law. It did not order immediate implementation, but only hearings on how segregation in schools should be abolished. But the Brown decision signaled the beginning of what was known as the Warren Court, as an active agent of social change, and it gave hope to many that segregation would soon end. The Brown case opened the floodgates to action against Jim Crow. The Brown decision animated civil rights activists who, after being rather dormant in the early 1950s, now believed that federal courts would back them. Mass action against Jim Crow developed quickly. In December 1955, Rosa Parks, a black department store worker in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to surrender her seat on a city bus to a white rider as local law required. Parks' arrest provoked a year-long bus boycott, which initiated the mass phase of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Within a decade, the Civil Rights Revolution overthrew legal segregation and regained the right to vote for black Southerners. While Parks was depicted as an ordinary woman fed up with Jim Crow, in fact, she was a veteran of civil rights struggles in the 1930s and 1940s. When news of her arrest spread through Montgomery, hundreds of blacks gathered in a local church and refused to ride the bus until they received equal treatment. For more than a year, despite harassment and violence, Montgomery's blacks maintained the bus boycott. In November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregation in public transportation was unconstitutional. The Montgomery bus boycott launched a nonviolent movement for racial justice based in the South's black churches. It was supported by Northern liberals and focused unprecedented international attention on U.S. racial policies. Through the boycott, Martin Luther King Jr., a pastor at a local Baptist church, became the movement's symbol. At the boycott's first protest meeting, King inspired his audience when he said that Southern blacks were, quote, tired of going through the long night of captivity, and that they were, quote, reaching out for the daybreak of freedom and justice and equality. From its beginning, the language of freedom marked the black movement. Freedom meant many different things, but most of all, it meant political rights and economic opportunities long denied because of skin color. King's rhetoric united ideas of freedom into a coherent whole. His most famous speech, I Have a Dream, given in 1963, began by noting the unfulfilled promise of emancipation and closed by invoking a cry from a black spiritual, quote, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last, end quote. King appealed to both blacks' sense of injustice and to the conscience of the white Americans by making the case for black rights in terms that united blacks' experience with that of the nation. A student of nonviolent civil disobedience proposed by Henry David Thoreau and Gandhi, King offered a philosophy of struggle in which evil was met with good, hate was met with Christian love, and violence was met with peaceful demands for change. His Christian themes came from the black church, and they resonated in the black community and in America. He appealed to white America by emphasizing blacks' loyalty to America as a nation and to their devotion to its redemptive values. Resistance. In 1956, building on success in Montgomery, Martin Luther King formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a coalition of black ministers and civil rights activists that was in charge of organizing desegregation efforts. But the fact that Montgomery's officials agreed to desegregate only when forced by a Supreme Court ruling showed that more than local action was necessary to end Jim Crow. The white South's refusal to accept the Brown decision showed that blacks would win their constitutional rights only by federal intervention. But the federal government did not step into the breach. Southern whites did, launching a campaign of massive resistance against desegregation in the South. In 1956, a full 82 of 106 Southern congressmen signed a Southern manifesto condemning the Brown case as an abuse of judicial power by the Supreme Court and calling for the lawful resistance to, quote, forced integration. Southern states soon passed laws to block desegregation efforts, and some even outlawed the NAACP in their state. Virginia was the first state to enact desegregation, but offered funds to white students, but not blacks, to attend private schools instead. Some localities shut down their schools entirely rather than desegregate them. The federal government tried to stay uninvolved. In 1957, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson, however, led some successful efforts in Congress to pass the first national civil rights law since Reconstruction. This law focused on black voters' rights in the South, but it had weak enforcement and little effect. President Eisenhower offered no moral leadership and called only for Americans to, quote, obey the law, while he publicly made it clear that he did not welcome civil rights agitation. In 1957, when Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas used the National Guard to prevent the court-ordered integration of Little Rock's Central High School, Eisenhower dispatched federal troops to the city to enforce it. Elsewhere, the federal government did little to hasten desegregation. Since the Cold War's beginnings, U.S. leaders worried that segregation actually tarnished America's reputation abroad. This continued in the late 1950s. Moreover, foreign nations and colonies also noticed the development of civil rights in America. Across the world, people of African descent celebrated the Brown decision, but the slow pace of change led to embarrassing criticisms of American diplomats abroad. The election of 1960. Focus question. What was the significance of the presidential election of 1960? The presidential campaign of 1960 was one of the closest in American history. Vice President Richard Nixon faced off against the Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was a young Massachusetts senator and a Roman Catholic whose father had been U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. Lyndon B. Johnson was Kennedy's running mate. Although World War II's atmosphere of tolerance had weakened anti-Catholicism after the war, many Protestants were wary of voting for Kennedy, fearing that a Catholic president would follow the Roman Catholic Church dictates in controversial public policy issues. Kennedy tried to dismiss such fears by disavowing any connection between his public positions and his church. Kennedy secured the Democratic nomination after he won the primary in the heavily Protestant West Virginia, and he soon faced off against Nixon. Both candidates were ardent Cold Warriors, but Kennedy argued that the Soviet Union's success in launching Sputnik, the first Earth satellite, into orbit, as well as the Soviet tests of the first intercontinental ballistic missile, showed that the United States, under the Republicans, had led to a missile gap, and that now the United States was lagging behind the USSR in the Cold War. Both Kennedy and Nixon knew that the United States military and economic capacity was far greater than the Soviets. But Kennedy's criticisms convinced many Americans that new leadership was needed. Kennedy's stylish wife, Jacqueline, also charmed many Americans, who seemed to want a young and energetic first family. In the first ever televised presidential debate, the handsome Kennedy ultimately bested Nixon. Nixon had a cold and somewhat tired demeanor, and he looked nervous on camera. Now, those who had listened to the debate on the radio thought Nixon had won the debate. But for those who watched it on TV, image counted for more than substance, and ultimately Kennedy won the election, but by a very narrow margin. In January 1961, shortly before leaving office, President Eisenhower delivered a televised farewell address. Ike warned against a new military buildup and urged Americans to think about the dangers of what he called a, quote, military-industrial complex, one that conjoined an enormous military establishment with a permanent arms industry and that could greatly influence politicians and policy. Remember, he was one of the generals who fought against the Nazis in World War II, and he worried that a military-industrial complex would be similar to what happened in Nazi Germany. But most Americans saw the military-industrial establishment not as a threat, but as a source of jobs and national security. The Vietnam War soon made Ike's words of caution seem very relevant. By the 1960s, the foundations of the 1950s life seemed to be collapsing. Cars and the chemicals produced and released by new consumer goods were found to be spoiling the environment and giving people cancer. Housewives rebelled against roles given to them in the suburban family, and blacks became impatient with the slow pace of racial progress. The 1960s had arrived.